Why is transparency of climate finance important? Because you can't measure the effectiveness of climate finance if you don't have transparency about it. You can't have clarity about whether there's a distinction between a promise and an actual disbursement without transparency. You can't track double counting and treble counting and quadruple counting without transparency. And most important of all, if you don't have clarity about exactly where the money is being spent and on what, because as with all development finance, an awful lot of the money never actually goes to developing countries in the first place, then you can't have coordination, and it isn't possible to empower recipient countries or indeed recipient citizens to plan around incoming flows and to reduce transaction costs and to hold people to account.
The trustee of the Amazon Fund and the National Climate Fund in Brazil is the National Development Bank, the BNDES. This bank is, it's not like a detail what the portfolio of this bank is today. It's bigger than the World Bank, its portfolio of investment, and it's the trustee of these two funds. And one example of this fiduciary secrecy in practice, very recent, was that one of the biggest private operators of oil drilling in the overseas oil drilling in Brazil went bankrupt, and after they went bankrupt, they realized they had receiving huge amounts of credit from the development bank, BNDES. So the Bloomberg news vehicle made the official request of information through the Access to Information Law to receive this contract, this subcontracting with this credits. What were the terms of the agreements with this company? And the bank, based on fiduciary stance, like saying that they could not provide this information based on the rights of the client of the secrecy. But we're talking about public money again. And we are talking about an activity that is in complete opposition to the resources, the scarce resources of climate finance. But you have the other hand of these development banks operating, giving low interest credits and low risk analysis for this old economy, this oil intensive, this carbon intensive industry, without any transparency, without any accountability of the use of this public resource. And now that went bankrupt, this is public money that was wasted there, investing in an opposition, like completely opposite to the investments and efforts for climate finance, and you don't have any access to this, even with the Access to Information Law in place there. But based on fiduciary secrecy, these financial vehicles are operated outside the mandate of this law.
The question of accountability of executive decision-making bodies is just not an academic one. It's actually real, and an example from TI is that prior to the selection of the host country of the Green Climate Fund, we actually received allegations of vote buying in terms of which country should actually get that seat. And in this particular case, we went to the Green Climate Fund Secretariat, we tried to propose it to the board, but the end result was that nobody was in charge. There was no particular body or oversight, and of course the Green Climate Fund is still was in its infancy, and there isn't a particular body for that. But I mean, there are quite a lot of discussions to look at cases where you do have, serious questions on the accountability or integrity of how decisions are being made and what kind of influences there are over that. So there should be at least the opportunity that there's a place or an independent body in place to try to look at that. And I think the message that sends at the global level would have a transformational impact in terms of the governments at the local and national level.
It's chaotic and complex because of the transversal and transnational character of it, the multi-dimensionality of the institutions involved, and legally, international institutions and funds fall into a very unclear part of international law in terms of accountability. So whilst David's right that there is a principle established in international law around the right to freedom of information, giving that right traction in this space is not easy. And that's why he's quite right to say that the procedural detail and the plumbing that should accompany such a principle or right is of absolute paramount importance. And that's one of the lessons that we've learned from national level freedom of information.
We have to remember also that there is a strive towards efficient use of resources. You have mentioned earlier the fact that some entities would mention the fact that it's costly to establish systems. So for example, if the UN Rights program was to, which is a 5-year program, was to establish a whistleblower system, set up an ombudsman person, have an ombudsman person, a grievance mechanism of its own, and so on, it would be quite costly, and that would divert resources that are supposed to go to the country level implementation. And this creates another issue of, of the climate finance. The bulk of it is intended to go at the country level. And this is one of the reasons why very often you will see reference made to existing systems of the bank or of the UN or of UNDP. Being able to be supported by existing structures and mechanisms as, as incomplete as they may be, is much better than not having any systems at all. Because as a program that had started just a couple of years before, it would have taken us quite a bit of time to get to the point where UNDP or FAO or UNEP are at this stage.
Certainly one issue is understandability. So if you look at generally a lot of these documents, they are extremely complex to try and be able to understand it. A big barrier we've seen with some of the banks is language. Some of them only publish in certain languages, especially English, and that's not necessarily very useful for local communities. And of course, findability. I mean, the ability to be able to even figure out what it is you're looking for is often, if you look at some of the websites, is very difficult. And that's it's not a trivial problem, but it's not something that the Googles of the world haven't already figured out in some ways that the banks could, or whoever the funds could learn a little bit better from.
Obviously, particularly with marginalized communities, again, who are mostly the ones who don't have the political clout, so probably wouldn't be necessarily the ones that get identified if you talk to the province governor or even the mayor of a community, or not necessarily even to the elder of a village. It's just, having to do some of the legwork beyond, thinking about other ways of reaching out, for example, beyond language. I mean, there's often the example, just giving a gender example. It will not work if you do a village outreach at a time frame where women have to take care of the children and are preparing the lunch or the dinner or whatever meal, so that you get just a bunch of guys that are telling you what the community wants, right? So anybody who will have to go on a mission trying to scope out the feasibility of a project needs to be conscious of the fact that whoever sits in the meeting might not be a representative sample of the people he or she wants to reach, or he or she wants to benefit from the project. And again, that might have to involve doing some more active legwork. It involves particularly also being aware that, just ticking off your met 10 people in village A for 2 hours, fulfilled my requirement for outreach, is not met or cannot be that easily met. So I mean, for example, with Gold Standard and others, it's a question of schooling the verifiers. It's also a question for the ones that are developing projects to be clear that, for example, their documentation of outreach efforts might have to be a little bit more comprehensive than just a checklist. Would be some of it. It's not easy, and I mean, as Peter says, I think it's a long road that we are on, but nothing will just basically substitute for plain efforts and outreach and communication, I think.
What we are trying to do is really to engage at local level. What does it mean? It means, first of all, to have an expertise in-house that is from those communities. We do have a gender and diversity inclusion policy in place at the IDB with the representatives of indigenous communities indigenous and local communities that do work with us. So it's very important to rely on this local expertise. Why? Because we need to be cultural appropriate, to understand very well the context over there, to speak the language, and to go really to the places. It's not, how can I say, sufficient to go to the capital, to Mexico City or to Lima or Bogota, but you really have to make an effort in order to be more capillary. But again, it's a problem of money and time, so you really have to invest on that particular aspect, and again, it's worth it for the sustainability of the operation.
There was one particular issue where the local community was very much affected by the actual construction of the dam. They had actually, due to the quarries, the stones flying through their roofs and had actually damages to their house. This we managed to solve by a mediation process, which in the end was successful because the mediators, the mediating parties, they agreed on camping, on an agreement. Basically, I think in the end, could also be thought of at the beginning, the government actually paying for the damages of the damaged houses. But it was a lot of face saving, a lot of mediation, and a lot of and we were able actually to not only fund that, but also be a party, select a mediator, be a party in the mediation, and not what some people think, do the mediation, and get the people online. So yes, we are actively involved, and actually to just, when I tell this to my children, it's always funny. You talk about the Bujagali Dam, which is down to $650 million in investment cost. The mediation cost was $50,000 on our budget, and the actual damages in the end were budgeted by the Ugandan government at $100,000. So if you talk about perspective and numbers, it's fantastic. And basically we think, we are very happy that this mediation process works, and I think that the Ugandan government has actually picked up the phenomenon of mediation as perhaps also to be used in other projects.
Funds such as the climate investment funds in particular, I think, have evolved from working in the way that a fund that gets started and has to move money very quickly often ends up having to work out of necessity without very many formal processes and systems in place, to having much more complete disclosure, even if it's not as complete as we might want it to be, in terms of, okay, what's the status of the money that we're receiving, what's the status of the money that we're now approving to go towards projects, even beginning to start to do some reporting on disbursement of funding, especially for the public sector, to recipient institutions. And I think that, part of what we see is an architecture that's in evolution, as it were. A lot of the institutions we're talking about are relatively recent, and they've been put together in a way that's really intended to harness the implementing capacity of their partnerships. So they're not funds in a classic sense. They are sources of funding that are intended to then harness the implementation capacity of other actors in the system. And I think that's the crucial nexus that we want to be thinking about when we talk about the ways in which fund standards and fund signals can then in turn make the most of existing systems where they are strong, but on the other hand, send a positive signal that's around upward harmonization, where implementing partner practices may vary to some extent. I do think that a crucial aspect in this regard is our capacity and willingness as civil society actors to take advantage of the increasing procedural space that we're asking for. So being ready, as it were, with the information and insights that are substantive and grounded that can then actually make these procedural innovations meaningful and useful. So in that sense, as we ask for better process and better systems, we also need to be prepared to occupy that space, as it were, with good inputs that make, it's a shared responsibility question to some extent.
A case of a forest that we received a complaint through our ELAC office in this coastal region, where NEMA officer, or the National Environmental Management Authority officer, who was supposed to be giving licenses for private investments, gave a license of a forest that was supposed to be community land and next to an ocean for construction of a crematorium, which at first the forest was made up of mangrove forests, and according to our policy act, it's a protected environment. But through our efforts and our ELAC offices were able to follow through and first of all to have the license cancelled, as well as hold the officer to account. As we speak, the officer is on leave to allow investigations. There are allegations that she, for purposes of protecting the officer, she received a bribe of about 1 million shillings from the private entity to issue the license, and also the private company also followed through the Ministry of Lands to have the license for the land, or the title deed for the land, which is community land in a forest. And it's an issue that we are following up to make sure that the title deed is reverted back to the forest community, as well as hinder further private investment in the forest.
The first step is to ask them what it is they want to know, and people usually have a pretty good idea. Turning that desire, that thirst and appetite for knowledge they don't have into something that's procedurally effective in terms of acquiring it is the step that's often tricky. And the literature on this from the freedom of information movement in the last 10, 15 years is that development NGOs, for example, sector NGOs, or community organisations struggle with the procedural aspects of freedom of information. Often they need a companion. Now, the good thing is that there's now a huge amount of expertise around the world in how to use access to information provisions, whether it's national level laws or voluntary procedures or international standards. So there's a huge body of practice and expertise to draw on. And indeed, my first proposal for our consideration would be that we actually pull together, and maybe TI has in a sense already started to do that with this kind of work, but to pull together, a bit like we did with the IFI transparency, the access to information community with the climate finance community, and to build an informal alliance of people that can share practice and learn from each other.
Meaningful engagement with climate finance likely requires information to be made available at different levels and in different formats. So you're going to need some simple information to cover sort of basic bases, and that's particularly, I think, important in the context of some of this accountability-related concerns in terms of just having basic awareness of what's happening in country so that people can know that there's something happening here, there's a space to watch. But I don't think that having information available in a simple form is a substitute for having complete information available. And some of that information is going to be complex. And if we want to engage with climate finance, which is a complex issue as civil society actors, we have to be prepared to engage with complexity. And so I think that this issue of multiple levels of information being essential to allow meaningful engagement is quite an important one. It's not enough to have simple information. It's not a substitute for having that opportunity for complete information.
If you really want to have ownership and responsiveness, you must have the flexibility in order to react to, respond to people's needs. And one of the problems is that most of the problems, especially if you talk about large programs, they are pre-designed. You know, we're going to build so many embankments, so many bridges, and you know, if it's not necessary anymore, there's little flexibility to actually respond to that. So we need, in the global funds, or some kind of flexibility, but it requires trust. That if you devolve sort of your power to a certain implementing organization, that organization must be flexible in order to, you know, adapt their program to whatever is happening. And this is also something that we've been arguing for. I mean, you need to, especially when you talk about climate change, where there's a lot of uncertainty. If you in the decision making on your interventions, you need flexibility in order to respond to saying, well, maybe this is not working, or we've done this intervention, but actually we see, you know, monitoring what is going on with our climate, and that we might have to shift our, and that is, and I think that's a challenge, for the whole architecture of this. And how do you ensure that flexibility while and still, you know, stick to rigid, you know, accountability and structures. But I mean, it is possible.
The point is this: if it's going to be transformational, even more reason for it to be country-owned, even more reason for it to be very inclusive at national level, even more reason then to include, as part of the transformational agenda, an authentically transparent one, where the actors and stakeholders who stand to lose or gain, depending on the change that comes, have a real voice in those choices. So that's the argument I would make at a rhetorical level. And our job then is to work out processes that will create political space for that to happen.